looks at the direct engagement of the public by archaeologists. So it is about archaeological communities, community archaeology online. And the first paper is the nature of archaeological communities and specialties online, and Bevan.
Okay, that's my title. Forgive me if, actually, on reflection, I stray slightly from that brief, hopefully not too much. What I'd like to talk about, well, I'd like to start by trying to re-emphasize a series of what I think are relatively important concepts that we should probably bear in mind when we think about the way in which archaeological communities form and behave online. And also when we think about the types of content and the types of debate that we might want to foster online. So I'll talk about things such as value, authority, and agency, and how they relate to this topic, hopefully. Another thing that I find interesting is the nature of human social relationships and the degree to which they're similar or different as they manifest themselves online. And I'll end by trying to look at a couple of case studies. So they relate to some of the things that I know a tiny bit more about, although by no means expert in some of these. The one is open communities. And we'll see in a second what those imply. Many of them actually relate to spatial data and spatial software. And communities that deal with the interesting topic of neogeography. But I'll leave that as a slightly elaborate term for now and come back to it in a little bit. Value. That's an incredibly ambivalent but quite a powerful term if you think about it. What do we mean by value? Well, we talk about things that are valuable, and they can be tangible things, or they can be intangible things. Sometimes we think that value in here is inherent in some sort of object, for example, that gold is inherently valuable, for example. But in fact, of course, if we think about it a little bit longer, that's not really true. These are all things that are built up by social consensus. People agree that something's valuable. Thereafter, for a while at least, it is valuable. Value is also something, in English and other languages, interlocked with issues of morality. So we talk about value and values. Values being often moral values. Taste, worth. All of those terms have that sort of ambivalence associated with them. How does that relate to the world online? Well, we have to think about value online. What is valuable to us in online experiences? Are we trying to monetize archaeology online, for example, as there was discussion about earlier, or are we trying to keep that apart from what we do online? If you just think about it for a moment, there are all sorts of problems with expressing and understanding value online. In the early days of the internet, for example, how do you make some money if you're a company online? Remember that for a long time the business model, the internet business model was an awkward thing. Nobody quite cracked exactly how you generate cash with online activity. So pay for content, pay for service, and then also, even if you're not interested in actually raking in the cash, you're interested in just having some sort of valuation of what you do online. You have to think about how you measure that. So people have tried hit counters, they've tried looking at page ranking systems based on linked networks of hyperlinks, so that's what Google does with search engines. Click-throughs, how many people click through sites, various kinds of efforts at personal data harvesting, reviews by individual users, shares, likes, retweets, all of those sorts of things. No single metric, of course, there never really is for value, but a whole range of different options. Some of those very blunt, others perhaps a bit more tailored to specific types of value. But I think if we're thinking about archaeological provisions online, we have to think about exactly how we measure value, also what kinds of value we're trying to to achieve, and also how it relates to morality, in a sense. And I'll come back to that at the end, hopefully. Another thorny one that's already come up a little bit today is a question of authority. Authority online and authority offline. That relates, of course, to value in all sorts of ways. Authority is a pretty powerful and also quite an ambivalent thing for many people. Authority is kind of nebulous, appears and disappears. It can exist for a long time, or it can exist for a short time. Somebody can have authority for, well, hopefully for the 20 minutes I'm up here talking to you. Or it can extend for an entire lifetime. It can be an institution, or an individual, or a community, or all sorts of different groups. People express authority physically in all sorts of ways. Dress, hairdos, certificates, badges. How does that happen? What happens when you take that online, where some of that paraphernalia is available to you, other bits of it are not? All of that's kind of interesting with respect to archaeology, simply because archaeology traditionally is thought of as a subject in which you do have authorities on certain subjects. Mortimer Wheeler, animal, vegetable and mineral, proclaiming on various kinds of object, exactly what they are about. So you get the expert and the guru telling you how to think about archaeology. And of course a lot of people would try to subvert that, use the online experience as a sort of subversion of that idea of authority. Let the online people decide effectively exactly why something's important, discuss it. And of course the entire continuum in between those two extremes, where we position ourselves in any given context with respect to how much authority we want to impose on an online experience is pretty important. Something to think about case by case, I'd say. Also, what kinds of ways do we measure authority online? Is it user badges for different qualities of user? Is it by community standards or certificates for various kinds of web compliance? Is it links to institutions? So UCL or the British Museum is a kind of stamp of authority. All of those are things that we really need to negotiate. Another related issue, well, just to step back maybe for one moment, linked to value and authority, of course, is that other term that's already come up, authenticity. We want authentic experience. Do we want authentic archaeological experiences online? That relates really to how people value things like physical engagement with objects versus virtual engagement with objects. The degree to which they feel they have had authentic archaeological experience if they only talk amongst themselves with no archaeological authority present. There are a whole range of different issues there as well. So value, authority, and authenticity, all pretty important terms. It'd be nice to sort of try and theorize about them as coherently as possible. Last one here, via the medium of asterisks, is agency, human, group, institutional agency. It obviously relates to the experience online because we have a weird combination of users online. We've got institutions that are there in the physical world, in real life, projecting themselves into an online space. The British Museum, UCL, are good examples. You have new institutions that are formed only within that online space. You've got individuals in the real world projecting themselves as individuals. Some of those project themselves as institutions in the online space. So you get a mix-up of agencies. And of course the artifact is not something you can move in any physical sense into the online space, but people interact with virtual artifacts online. So for some people's interpretation of that term, they themselves gain a certain agency. So we have to probably try and think about those a little bit more. At least that's the way I'd argue it. This last set down there in the bottom are quite important. The difference between a physical community existing in real life and the kinds of communities that we get in an online space. How different are they? Of course, a lot of the online communities are communities of shared experience or endeavour, project-driven, or a certain culture that exists perhaps only online. be interesting to see whether that makes any difference to the nature of those communities. And I think it comes up sort of implicitly in a lot of people's discussion of archaeology online, and in fact most online provisions, whatever the discipline, whatever the interest group, is the fact that social relationships may be quite different as they manifest themselves online. So if we just think about traditional social relationships between people, there are clearly all sorts of different ways in which we relate to one another. That's pretty obvious. So we can have commercial partnerships with one another. We can have relationships that are very strongly driven by status differences. We can have relationships that are driven by deliberate situations in which we try and trade off in a reciprocal way, like classic anthropological models of the gift or whatever. So an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Those are all possible ways in which we can relate to one another. Some people, Alan Fisk at UCLA, for example, has gone to town on this, and you could trace it back through a whole lot of anthropology. Marcel Mauss, a whole bunch of people who try and deal with what kinds of models people use when they relate to one another. And bear with me, and I'll turn to the issue of the internet and online archaeology in a second. But you can have people that, when they interact, try to emphasize, cue to one another, i.e. give little indicators to one another, that they want to relate in terms of community relationships, communal sharing, as Fisk would call it. And then you're basically trying to welcome people into a family, where the values of the family are sort of universal, and you're either part of that group or you're not. In other situations, it's very different. It's all about status. Are you above or below somebody in a hierarchical organization? In other situations, as I said, you've got these reciprocal relationships, what Fisk would call equivalence matching, and in others, fairly sort of commercial or pseudo-commercial relationships, what he called market pricing. Now, whether you buy into those branded terms, and of course that's anthropological lingo, sociological lingo, it's not so important really, is to sort of at least recognize the fact that all of these potential relationships exist out there in the real world. And perhaps their models, the way in which people think about relationships, is driven by wanting to pigeonhole them into one of those categories. People get very angry when they think they're working under one of those guises, and in fact they realize they're working in a different one. A good example would be if I give somebody a gold ring as part of a wedding ceremony, and that person then goes and flogs it on the market. Most people tend to get pretty angry about that, at least if they're still together. Because, of course, you'd be thinking about that as falling into that first category. That's a gift to do with what you do with somebody who's part of your very close circle. It's not supposed to be a relationship based on monetized affairs. So, lots of theoretical jargon, perhaps, but I think some of that becomes relevant when we think about online communities. Because there is a myth, perhaps not a myth, perhaps a reality out there, that online communities are these kinds of things. Communal, very open, often very democratic. Perhaps if you were trying to think of a negative term, you might say highly tribal in nature. But that's the stereotype, right or wrong. That the internet as a technology drives that kind of relationship more than these other ones. So that kind of thing, not these kinds of things, perhaps this one, but not so much those ones in between. Subverts authority, for example, is the classic sort of thing that a lot of people say. So if we think about archaeology in the way in which it might insert itself into these different kinds of online fora, so newsgroups, Skype, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Foursquare, geocaching forums, all that sort of thing. Specialist websites for programmers, digital content, all of that. We do tend to think that they are this kind of model of social relationships and not others. Is this correct? Well, I'd argue that actually partly that's to do with the pioneer effect of the internet. The early stages are manifesting themselves that way, and perhaps the internet as a technology does encourage these open communities. But I think you can see in things like, for example, the badging systems that you get in certain kinds of website nowadays, so where people become level 2 community moderator. So given the authority to make decisions, for example, about cutting out responses on websites that are deemed as inappropriate. They're not the person who runs the website, they're just somebody who's been given that new status. That's true in a variety of websites. This happens to be, I think it's Huffington Post, but a whole series of them that take this this badging quite seriously. Is that incipient status? Probably. I'll leave that for a second and just try and look at some quick examples. I'll skip through them as quickly as possible of two broad types of community online that I've vaguely had a look at. One is those sets of communities that emphasize very strongly a sort of open ethos. This is part of a very broad agenda, for a wide variety of disciplines on providing either open data that is free of copyright issues, open knowledge more generally of procedures in various government departments, for example, or tightly linked to software, free and open source software. We'll come back to that in a second. In archaeology, as we'll see, there is a whole movement for open archaeology. And it has to do with information. So for some people that's a great thing. For others, such as the nice man in this cartoon, they're less sure. Suppose information doesn't want to be free. Suppose what information really wants is to be meted out in tiny, controlled doses at outrageous prices. Those are your sort of two opposing extremes, if you like. For people who get very biblical about it, this is the rivalry which people point to between commercial software on the one hand, and I'm thinking mainly of some of the ones that are used in statistics and GIS, and free and open source software on the other. So software does the same things, but with two totally different philosophies about how you go about doing it, achieving it. On the one hand, software that's built as closed source. You can't see the code, but you just buy the product and buy a whole bunch of extras that help you with that product. So phone lines that give you help, various kinds of online pay-for-use university courses, a whole range of things. And Microsoft Office is a good example, ArcGIS, the Adobe Suite, all of those are commercial software. Crucial thing, the code is closed. You can't reuse it. It's in compiled form. Free and open source software, the opposite ethos is one in which the code is open. You can investigate the code, modify it, pass it on, in many cases even, or not in all cases, sell it on, if you wish. The user communities are very, very different as well. The way they operate socially is entirely different. So a lot of that goes on online. I won't dwell on this too much, but what the people online, say the free and open source end of that continuum of software producers say, is that commercial software is black box, i.e. you can't see the code, so you don't necessarily understand the algorithms. It locks in, it's an effort by vendors to lock in users. You often give the software away cheaply to people like students, and then hope that when they leave, they buy expensive licenses. And they also say that open source software is better for communities of interest that are quite small in scale. If you were to look at them on a frequency histogram, they'd be at the tail end of that distribution. Not many users. Archaeology is a classic case. We're not going to have the punching power to tell Microsoft Office or Esri ArcGIS we want a specific bit of functionality. Just aren't a big enough user group. So they'd say all of those are big issues for why we should use these open and, in many ways, online promoted approaches. So, interesting thing is, sociologically, how does this fit within our idea of a stereotype of a very open community, a certain kind of set of social relationships, and is it really quite as open as all of that? Well, I personally think it's a very good thing, first of all, so just to make my position clear. It has an ideology of free, as in free speech, so very strongly the idea that everyone interacts in an egalitarian way and makes their voice heard. And people have talked about it, it's like a gift economy. or a guild system, or a barter economy, or a kinship system. So people certainly think about free and open source software in these social terms. However, only certain people are going to have the skills to participate in some of these open communities, say software developers, people with the right kinds of programming skills. Also, there are interesting sociological effects that some people, well, only people are now talking about, such as the fact that an even more skewed gender distribution is behind open source software. So even fewer, an even smaller proportion of women are involved in open source software than in the general programming world, at least at the moment. So some issues there in terms of exactly how open, how much it fits that sort of communal sharing model. Just to note, there are a whole range of different open data communities. Open data is slightly different from what I was just talking about. Open data is less about the programming and more about just the provision of information. So in archaeology, you've got a range of generally UK or Italian and now US-based sites that emphasize this idea to varying degrees. Their philosophies are not all exactly the same. Okay. Do I have 5 minutes or so? Good. Last example I wanted to talk about is neogeography. This is, to a degree, geography as transformed by modern spatial technologies, and also particularly by the types of participation that get engendered by the internet. So, for example, it refers to various kinds of locational information that people provide informally through things such as Google Earth. When somebody geotags something on Google Earth, one of their holiday snaps. So here's somebody who's taken a digital camera video of a nice beach next to an archaeological site in western Crete, and they've geotagged it, and it's now on Google Earth. So that's a classic example. A whole range of other, as we'll see in a second, a whole range of other behaviors, social behaviors associated with this, but all very much linked up to this idea of Web 2.0 technologies. More participation, greater levels of public engagement. So we've also got geosocial networks, where actually the social network that you might get on a site such as Facebook is given some sort of added spatial kick, if you like, through the locational mechanisms that you, for example, get in a mobile phone. So the fact that there's a GPS built into the mobile phone allows people to express where they are in real physical space, check in, for example, at a particular site in London, and thereby allow all sorts of interesting things to ensue, some of which are very commercially driven. So that, for example, you could have advertising that hits you as you arrive at a certain place in London, for example, because your phone knows that you're there. But also it allows you to socialize with other individuals in ways that have a sort of physical manifestation as well. Geocaching. This is an interesting one from the perspective of archaeology, simply because, well, it doesn't start in archaeology, it's more of a sort of ecologically driven thing. The idea is that people place, for those of you who have not come across it, people place small boxes of things in particular locations out there in the landscape somewhere in the world. They log on to a website and put up the coordinates, the GPS coordinates of that particular box, and then other people go and try and find that box, and then perhaps either change some of the objects that are placed in that box, or write down their names, and then register that they've been there online. So it's essentially sort of treasure hunting without much treasure out there in the real world, but enabled very much by the online experience. So this one's great. We approached the tunnel from such a coordinate. We found from where we followed the gravel road directly to the cache. When we first followed the tunnel, we were really impressed. After some painful contact with wasps, which built their home in the pipe nearby, the hideout, we retrieved the well-stocked cache, etc., etc. So this is the type of experience that people are sharing online. It's interesting because it's quite, at least as expressed online, it's quite a sort of ecologically sensitive a practice. People are very careful to say that they've looked after the environment as they've gone through their geocaching experiences, typically. But of course, we can see there's either very positive or very negative from an archaeological perspective, because it does sort of encourage that in real life, physical treasure hunting idea. So where it interfaces with actual archaeological sites or known archaeological locations is a bit of an awkward issue. To what degree do we promote people geocaching in the neighbourhood of major archaeological remains is a little bit tricky. I think all of these, a lot of these new methods for combining social relationships online with spatial location will come together quite well. So you could have the addition, for example, of augmented reality experiences, such as, for example, 3D models that appear to you on your smartphone when you arrive at a certain location. You can combine those with things like geocaching and geosocial networking to provide quite a rich experience in future. My main question is not, well, my main purpose is not really so much to get into the detail of those individual methods and interesting sort of possibilities in the future. It's more to try and return at the end, without any answers, but perhaps with a few questions, to how we might think about issues of value, authority, authenticity, social relationships, with respect to those converging geosocial technologies. To what degree do we have to worry about the value of what people find at geocache locations? To what degree do we project authority in any one of those experiences? Is it all about people talking to one another in a very heterogeneous way on, say, geocaching websites, or should it be about people interceding and offering real bits or specific bits of information from, say, institutions such as UCL or a museum? All of that's, I think, a bit up for grabs, but at present, maybe slightly under-discussed. Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions?
Oh, that's one. I'm a big devotee of open source stuff in general. Do you think it would be true to say that archaeologists haven't really got to grips with open source software and don't realise that they're not just in the position of being consumers of computing and software? They could actually develop their own stuff with specifically archaeological content and ways of interacting, if only they realised they could.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people feel that it's too steep a learning curve to face at any point of their lives or careers, whatever you want to call it. I think you probably need to catch people at a certain point to really get them on board with that idea, and probably it's in thinking about, say, postgraduate education. That's probably a great moment to do so. Typically speaking, with a few exceptions, I guess that's not the case in archaeological education so far. People tend to feel that in university education you teach somebody the basics, the nuts and bolts of existing technology first, and then they either bring programming and other things like that to the table already, or they try and learn it at some unspecified future point, which actually is pretty tricky.
Anyone else? Yes.
Just wondering about sort of Wikipedia and how that fits into some of the models you presented, because the ideas of authority come from frequency of use and updating and maintenance, and certainly speaking to several Wikipedians, some come from that open data format, open data environment, and others are actually more into the actual Wikimedia community broadly, and that idea of, certainly this is just an anecdotal handful I've met, but that their agenda seems to be far more about encouraging greater participation, getting more people to engage with the sites. But then the counter to that is that they are they get a little bit concerned about ideas of authority because of the bias it brings. So when English Heritage goes and decides they're going to maintain particular websites about their properties, no, that's just really frowned upon because English Heritage is coming in with their own bias, their own agenda, and they're perfectly happy to receive information from English Heritage, but really the editing is done by the community. And I felt it fell through some of the models you created.
It's a really interesting example where it's very difficult to know where to place it. It's I don't think, for example, that many offerings fall at the extreme ends of that continuum of authority. No authority, total authority. I think they bounce backwards and forwards in between. And I think you can watch Wikipedia oscillate within that sort of space. And I don't think anyone knows whether it will ever fall into a sort of a specific location along that continuum or not. I think it's more interesting to think of it as something that always is going to have to negotiate that issue. I think it's a foolish idea to try and make it an authoritative resource, even if people, me included, use it that way often, go and check on Wikipedia for something. I don't think an institution should necessarily try to put its stamp on it. Something personal.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Andy. Now the social web. Lorna Richardson, who's doing a PhD about public archaeology and the digital, will talk about social networking and archaeology, and in particular about how archaeologists use Twitter. So.
Thank you. I'm a PhD student at the Centre for Digital Humanities at UCL. I'm looking at social media technologies and their use in archaeology. I'm in the middle of this project, so I'm going to be talking a bit about the research that I've done so far and a bit about the data that's been produced, but it is work in progress, so I do apologise if some of it feels a bit open-ended. For those of you that don't know, and I have a horrible feeling that quite a large number of you in here are Twitter users already, but I just don't know who you are. I don't know a lot of you. I know you from Twitter, but I don't know your faces. Twitter is a web-based application. It's a mixture of social networking, status updating and blogging. Anybody can register for it. You can post almost anything you like as long as you have a limit of 140 characters. It was originally designed to be used with mobile phones, which is why it has a short character limitation. It asks you to write what's happening, so basically it's asking you to write a status update on what you're doing at that point in time. But it's been going for 5 years now, and since its beginning it's developed into a massive platform for news. It's a really fast way of finding out news, commentary, opinions, networking, politics. Has adopted it massively. Obviously, marketing is a big part of it. Political activism, as I say, documenting events. So those of you that are tweeting at the moment, there is a digital back channel going on while we're here, of which I've been sitting there part of. People have been tweeting about reactions and comments and discussions behind what's been going on up here on Twitter. Access to always on broadband means that it's sort of really growing, numbers are increasing, Wi-Fi in public places is increasing. So people are using Twitter around the clock. A year or so ago, Twitter would probably have been something that would be used during a working week, but there have been massive changes in people's access and use of it at weekends and evenings, for example. So how does it work? Well, you can access it through wireless mobile devices like your smartphone or your iPad or any other tablet you may have, SMS. You can bypass the 140 character limit by shortening your links, and you can use third-party applications to do that. So there are things like Bitly or